was teaching a history class in London. A British student, about 17 years old, raised her hand and asked, "So when did Britain abolish slavery?" I told her 1833 in most of the empire. She looked relieved and said, "See, we were the first to end it. We're the good guys." I explained that Britain was also one of the largest slave traders for centuries before that. She looked confused and said, "No, that was America. Britain just ended slavery." I showed her documentation of British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. She said, "Well, that can't be in the exam. I've never heard that before." Her classmates agreed, saying they'd only learned about Britain ending slavery, not participating in it. I work at a museum in Bristol. A British man in his 50s was looking at our transatlantic slave trade exhibit. He said to his wife, "I don't understand why we have to keep going on about this. It was hundreds of years ago." His wife agreed, saying, "Britain apologised. What more do they want?" I mentioned that Bristol's wealth was built on the slave trade. He said, "Yes, but we also built schools and hospitals with that money, so it balanced out." I explained that enslaved people received no benefit. He said, "But their descendants live in developed countries now. That's something." His wife said, "We gave them civilization. They should be grateful we're even acknowledging the difficult bits." I was a tour guide at a plantation museum in the Caribbean. A British tourist asked, "So were British plantation owners cruel, or is that exaggerated?" I told her the conditions were horrific and well documented. She said, "Yes, but compared to other countries, British slavery was more humane, wasn't it?" I explained that slavery is inherently inhumane regardless of nationality. She said, "I just mean we had rules and regulations. The British were organised about it." Her husband said, "Exactly. British efficiency meant things ran more smoothly. Other countries were chaotic. They genuinely believed British slavery was somehow better because it was organised. They couldn't grasp that enslaving people is wrong, regardless of methodology." I work at a university in India. During a lecture on colonialism, a British exchange student said, "But colonialism wasn't all bad. Britain brought railways and schools to India." An Indian student responded that those were built to extract resources, not help Indians. The British student said, "But you still have them now. You're benefiting from British investment." Another Indian student said the cost in lives and stolen wealth far outweighed any infrastructure. The British student got defensive and said, "This is anti-British bias. You're only focusing on negatives. Why not appreciate what Britain gave you?" She genuinely couldn't understand why Indians weren't grateful for colonial infrastructure built through exploitation. I was working at a historic site in Kenya. A British couple was touring a colonial-era building. The man said, "These buildings are beautiful. The British really knew how to build." I mentioned they were built using forced labour. He said, "Well, people needed jobs. At least Britain provided employment." His wife said, "And look at the craftsmanship. Kenyans should be proud these buildings are still standing." I explained that many Kenyans have complicated feelings about colonial architecture. She said, "That's silly. Architecture is architecture. It's not political." He said, "If anything, Kenya should thank Britain for leaving behind such nice building." They took photos posing in front of the colonial structures, completely oblivious to the historical trauma they represented. I work at a bookshop in Dublin. A British customer picked up a book about the Irish famine. He read the back and said, "I didn't know Ireland had a famine. When was this?" I told him 1845 to 1852. He said, "And Britain helped, right? We're good at disaster relief." I explained that British policies made the famine worse, and many historians consider it genocidal. He looked shocked and said, "That can't be right. Britain wouldn't do that." I showed him several historical sources. He said, This sounds like Irish propaganda. Every country has famines. You can't blame Britain for weather." His friend said, "Exactly. The Irish are just bitter. They need to move on. They left without buying the book." I was a teacher in Scotland. During a lesson on the Highland clearances, an English student said, "But that was landowners, not the British government." I explained that the government supported and enabled the clearances. He said, "Well, Scotland is British too, so it's not like England did it to Scotland." A Scottish student said that the clearances were absolutely England asserting control over Scotland. The English student said, "You're being dramatic. It was just land management. People were relocated, not killed." I showed him the historical records of violence and forced displacement. He said, "That's probably exaggerated. British history isn't taught like that in England. We learned we brought civilization everywhere." He refused to accept that British actions in Scotland were oppressive. I work at a heritage centre in Jamaica. A British visitor asked why we don't have more positive exhibits about British rule. I told him the legacy of British rule in Jamaica was largely negative. He said, "But what about the legal system, the government structure? You still use Westminster democracy." I explained those systems were imposed through colonialism. He said, "Yes, but they work, don't they? Jamaica is stable." His wife said, "Without British governance, Jamaica would be chaos. You should have a section thanking Britain for bringing order." I told them many Jamaicans prefer to celebrate independence. She said, that's revisionist history. Young people are being taught to hate Britain instead of appreciating what we built. They wanted us to glorify colonial rule. I was working at a museum in South Africa. A British man was reading about apartheid. He said to his companion, at least Britain wasn't involved in this. This was South Africa's problem. I overheard him mention that British colonial policies laid the groundwork for apartheid. He said, no, apartheid started in 1948 after Britain left. I explained the continuity of British racial policies. He said, you can't blame Britain for what South Africa did after independence. We left. They made their own choices. His companion said, exactly. Britain left South Africa better than we found it. What they did afterward isn't our responsibility. They refused to acknowledge British colonial racism as foundational to apartheid. I work at a library in Pakistan. A British researcher asked for materials on the partition of India. When I brought him books detailing the violence, he said, this seems very anti-British. I told him the partition was traumatic and millions died. He said, but Britain did its best to manage a difficult situation. The violence was between Indians and Muslims, not caused by Britain. I explained that the rushed British withdrawal and arbitrary border draw directly caused the violence. He said, you can't blame Britain for religious tensions that already existed. His colleague said, Britain tried to leave peacefully. If locals couldn't behave, that's not our fault. They positioned partition violence as inevitable rather than a consequence of British decisions. I was a guide at a fort in Sri Lanka. A British tourist asked, so did the British treat Sri Lankans well during colonial rule? I told him colonial rule was exploitative and oppressive. He said, but compared to other colonial powers, Britain was fair, wasn't it? I explained that British rule in Ceylon involved forced labour, resource extraction and cultural suppression. He said, yes, but we didn't massacre people like the Belgians did in Congo. That's something. His wife said Britain was civilized about colonialism. We built institutions and infrastructure other empires just took. They ranked colonial powers and genuinely believed Britain's colonialism was acceptable because it was supposedly less violent than others. I work at a cultural centre in Malaysia. A British expat said to me, Malaysians are lucky Britain colonized them and not Japan or someone else. At least Britain left you with good systems. I told him many Malaysians don't see it that way. He said, but look at your legal system, your education system, your railways, all British. You'd be nowhere without us. I explained that Malaysia was a thriving civilization before colonialism. He laughed and said, come on, be realistic. Britain brought you into the modern world. His wife said it's fashionable now to criticize colonialism, but in 50 years, people will recognize Britain did more good than harm. They couldn't imagine that colonized people had agency and achievement before British arrival. I was working at a conference in Ghana. A British academic presented on colonial history. A Ghanaian professor challenged his framing, saying it minimized British violence. The British academic said, we need balanced history, not just anti-colonial narratives. The Ghanaian professor said, balance doesn't mean whitewashing oppression. The British academic said, calling everything Britain did oppression is simplistic. We brought education, healthcare, infrastructure. The Ghanaian professor said, those came at the cost of sovereignty and self-determination. The British academic said, but Ghana wasn't capable of those things before colonialism. The room went silent. He genuinely didn't realize how offensive that was. He later complained that African academics were too emotional about colonialism to be objective. I work at a school in England. A British teenager told me, my granddad said the empire was good because it spread English and democracy. I asked if she'd learned about colonial violence. She said, we learned Britain made mistakes, but overall it was progress. I asked about famines, massacres and resource extraction. She said, that's all debated though, isn't it? Some historians say it wasn't that bad. I showed her primary sources documenting atrocities. She said, this is depressing. Why do we have to focus on the negative? Can't we be proud of British history? She wanted a sanitized version that let her feel patriotic without confronting uncomfortable truths. I was a curator at a museum in Bangladesh. A British visitor asked why our independence exhibit portrayed Britain negatively. I explained that British rule in Bengal involved famines, exploitation and violence. He said, but Britain also built Calcutta into a major city. Where's that exhibit? I told him we focus on Bengali achievements and the independence struggle. He said, that's one-sided. You're teaching children to hate Britain. His wife said, this is what's wrong with post-colonial countries. You dwell on the past instead of being grateful for what Britain left you. I explained that Bangladesh has the right to tell its own history. He said, fine, but it's inaccurate. British rule was complicated, not just bad. They wanted us to downplay colonial harm. If you've enjoyed British people rewriting history in real time, give it a like and subscribe for more. Cheers.